It's become a focal point for anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine mandate protesters. Victoria's current state of emergency is set to end on December 15 and can't be renewed. So the state government drafted new legislation to replace it.
These arrangements are modelled on what happens in New Zealand. They're modelled on what happens in New South Wales.
But the bill triggered serious blowback from some human rights groups, prominent lawyers and protesters. Their main concerns? The Premier being able to declare a pandemic without putting it to Parliament, the transfer of emergency powers from the Chief Health Officer to the Health Minister, targeted health orders based on profiling of age, vaccination status or location, and the ability to extend the powers indefinitely.
The government will basically have just too much control without any checks and balances.
After broader consultation last night, the government made significant amendments, including a reasonable grounds requirement for declaring a pandemic and for issuing targeted health orders, significantly reduced penalties for breaching health orders, safeguards around the right to protest, and increased powers for an independent oversight committee.
The bill is filled with safeguards, oversight mechanisms that far exceed any other state, I think, perhaps any other country.
That was enough to secure the support of three key crossbenchers.
They have listened to the community, they've listened to everyone, and that they are now going forward with something that the community can have confidence in.
We can support this bill with the improvements and amendments, or we can leave the state of Victoria with no public health laws in the midst of a pandemic, which would be completely irresponsible.
But it's done nothing to placate protesters.
The only way you can really fix this bill is by tearing the whole thing up.
Why is the Parliament of Victoria fixated on passing legislation to enable more lockdowns?
There are some who called for exactly these measures just a few weeks ago, and as soon as the government did it, they changed their position. That's the definition of a political game.
So are these new pandemic powers a sensible compromise, dangerous overreach, or somewhere in between?
Well, the Reason Party's Fiona Patton is one of the crossbenchers that has thrown their support behind the legislation. She joins us now. Fiona, what was it that sealed the deal for you?
Look, what sealed the deal for me was way back in March when I really was asked to support an extension to Victoria's state of emergency legislation, and I was very reluctant to do it. And at that time I said, look, I would only support an extension if we went to developing specific legislation to deal with this pandemic and future pandemics.
Fiona, isn't the Chief Health Officer exactly the person you want to be in charge of declaring a pandemic? Are you concerned that this falls now to the Health Minister?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the people that complained about the state of emergency legislation were concerned that politicians could hide behind the Chief Health Officer and his advice. So what we've got now, which I think works in a much more, I suppose, a much more democratic system, is that the Premier, on the advice of the Chief Health Officer, will declare the pandemic, but then it will be the Health Minister on advice of the Chief Health Officer that will then make any orders that are required under that declaration. And at all times, the Chief Health Officer's advice must be published and made available.
Criticism, as I understand it, though, is if, for example, the Premier is stretching the advice of the Chief Health Officer, there's actually nothing anyone can really do about that. Is there any oversight mechanism or anything, not that will advise against it, but that will actually stop a Premier from going further than the advice suggests? OK, so if we play this out a little bit, so the Premier makes the advice to make a pandemic declaration. The Chief Health Officer says there's no pandemic. So the advice is that there's no pandemic, but the Premier ignores that advice. That advice is published. The Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee in the Parliament then looks at that. That committee would probably have to say we have to disallow this declaration because there is no pandemic, so it's outside the legislation. So if this very fierce Premier was to go against every single piece of advice, I wouldn't even worry about pandemic legislation and I'd just make it up because obviously that's the type of person that Premier would be. Well, not really. I mean, the whole point is that you want the legislation to survive that kind of Premier. Like you want it to be able to deal with someone who wants to abuse their power. And what I've heard from you there is a lot of recommendations, a lot of declarations, but nothing that's genuinely preventative. Is there something genuinely preventative from this being abused?
I honestly think that the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee, which does have the power to put a disallowance motion into the House. Now, whether the House would support that disallowance motion is up to the House, but we can put it there. Now,
sorry, Fiona, but that means
and then
it's
you've
political,
got a chief
right?
health officer.
That means it's always at every stage of political process. Whereas I guess the idea was if you had,
you've got,
for example, a chief health officer who was responsible not for all the orders, but just for declaring the pandemic.
Yep.
Well, no, he's not acting against the law. He has the power to do it. He's acting against the advice, and there is no mechanism, it seems, to stop him from doing or her from doing that.
No, he can only do this if there is a pandemic, and the chief health officer has to say there is a pandemic. I take your point, Walid, that we would require a parliament to oppose the Premier in this case, but a Premier right now could actually do that. And I think it's a fairly wild suggestion that you would have a Premier ignore the Chief Health Officer, act outside the pandemic legislation, refuse to vote for a disallowance motion on a declaration that has been opposed by the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee. This would be a Premier that had absolutely no regard to the law, and this would be a very dangerous Premier.
Yes, it would. But there are also wild powers that the Premier has in a situation like this. That's why it's so sensitive. Wouldn't the simplest way through it just be that should be in the hands of a scientific body or the CHO or someone who's not a politician? And then you take care of the whole problem, don't you?
I guess I would argue that that's exactly what we've got, that unless the Chief Health Officer says there's a pandemic, it would be outside the law for a Premier to call a declaration of a pandemic. So we have that in the legislation. We could try and make this better, but it's hard to suggest that we'd try and make a law that protected us from a Premier breaking the law.
All right, Fiona, we'll have to leave it there. Hopefully we don't have to be in this situation ever again, but we appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you very much.